I want you to picture a piece of real estate that is just so physically insignificant, you genuinely need a magnifying glass to find it on a standard globe.
Yeah, it's incredibly small.
Right. We're talking about a tiny rock, maybe 20 to 25 square kilometers in total area.
Barely 10,000 people live there, I think.
Exactly. And the vast majority of them are just, temporary contractors, engineers, maybe their families. But here is the wild part. The fate of the global economy, the inflation rate hitting you at your local grocery store, and the literal survival of a heavily armed geopolitical regime, all of that rests entirely on the limestone foundations of this one specific island.
It genuinely drew my traditional geopolitical logic.
Yeah.
I mean, you have these massive continental powers, vast military alliances, and yet the fulcrum of an entire region's stability is just sitting on a speck of land in the upper Persian Gulf.
It's fascinating. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking the incredibly tense, high-stakes geopolitics surrounding Kharg Island.
Right, which is located just about 25 kilometers off the coast of Iran.
Yeah. And our mission today is to break down a really glaring contradiction from the military actions we saw in March and April of 2026.
A huge contradiction.
Because if you look at the raw data of that kinetic campaign, the United States military executed this highly complex series of precision strikes on the island. They hit roughly 90 separate targets.
90 targets, yeah.
But they deliberately walked right past the island's single most valuable asset. So the goal here is to figure out the underlying mechanics of that decision. Why spare the golden goose?
Well, to do that, we really have to isolate the signal from the noise. We need to examine the situation through two distinct, sort of colliding frameworks.
Okay, lay those out for us.
First, we have to understand the sheer uncompromising survival logic of the Iranian regime. And second, we have to decode the intricate, heavily layered strategic calculus of American foreign policy that was actively playing out during those strikes.
Got it. So let's establish the physical reality of the board first. Because Iran has a massive, sprawling coastline, right? It stretches all the way down the Persian Gulf and into the Gulf of Oman.
Oh, yeah. It's a huge coastline.
So why is this one tiny island the undisputed center of their universe? I mean, why put all your eggs in a basket that's just sitting out in the open water?
It really comes down to a stubborn reality of geographic destiny, specifically bathymetry.
Bathymetry, that's the measurement of water depth, right?
Exactly. Because the modern global energy market doesn't run on your standard cargo ships. It runs on very large crude carriers, or VLCCs.
And those ships are absolute monsters.
Staggering in scale. I mean, they can carry 2 million barrels of oil in a single trip. 2 million.
Wow.
But to load a ship of that mass, you need incredibly deep water. Otherwise, the ship literally just scrapes the ocean floor.
And the Persian Gulf is notoriously shallow.
Yeah, exactly. Iran's mainland coastal waters simply do not have the natural depth to accommodate the draft of a fully loaded supertanker. You physically cannot bring those ships to the mainland.
Oh, I see.
But Kharg Island sits perfectly positioned in naturally deep waters. Because of that single geographic quirk, the island possesses the specialized T-jetties and sea island terminals required to load those behemoths.
So it transforms the island into an absolute, unavoidable bottleneck.
Precisely. It handles over 90% of Iran's crude oil exports.
90%. Let me make sure I'm visualizing the infrastructure, right? Because the engineering here is wild. You have massive networks of subsea pipelines, right?
Yep. Pulling crude oil right from the mainland fields.
Dragging it across the ocean floor and then pumping it directly into a sprawling farm of storage tanks on this one island.
That's the physical mechanism. But the political mechanism is even more critical. I mean, that subsea pipeline doesn't just pump crude oil. It pumps political power. Well, since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the foreign exchange revenue generated on Kharg Island has been the literal lifeblood of the Iranian leadership structure.
Ah, so it's the ultimate funding mechanism.
Exactly. It pays the saddles of the Revolutionary Guard. It subsidizes the domestic economy to prevent mass civil unrest, which is huge.
Right.
And it generates the hard currency required to fund their vast network of proxy forces across the Middle East.
So if you sever those subsea pipelines or if you level those storage tanks, that foreign exchange revenue doesn't just dip. It drops off an absolute cliff to zero.
Zero, yeah.
I keep thinking about this in terms of network architecture. It's exactly like a massive multinational corporation deciding to run its entire global operation, like every transaction, all its data, its entire security apparatus, through a single highly exposed server room sitting in a glass box in the middle of a busy intersection.
That is the perfect way to conceptualize it. It's the purest definition of a single point of failure.
But wait, if this island is literally their exposed server room, how has it survived this long? I mean, surely someone has tried to unplug it before. I'm thinking back to, like, the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s.
Oh, absolutely.
Saddam Hussein had to know this was their weak point, right?
He absolutely knew. During the tanker war phase of that conflict in the mid-'80s, Iraq bombed Kharg Island relentlessly. They dropped thousands of munitions on those facilities.
Wow, thousands.
Yeah. And this is where you really begin to understand Iran's survival logic. They view energy security and regime security as the exact same concept. There is no separation.
So they just threw everything at fixing it.
Exactly. During that war, the regime took astronomical casualties and spent unimaginable sums to rapidly repair pipelines mid-bombardment. They even established a shuttle service of smaller tankers just to keep the oil moving.
They treated it like a vital organ.
Precisely. They proved they will endure any cost to keep that server room online. So today, they view this soft underbelly with such gravity that they've surrounded it with, rapid response coastal defense, cruise missiles, layered air defense networks, massive drone fleets.
Because they know losing it is game over.
Right. Losing Kharg Island doesn't mean a temporary economic recession. It means immediate, total systemic collapse.
Okay, so if we understand that Kharg is the ultimate prize and the ultimate vulnerability, let's fast forward to the spring of 2026. The American strategic calculus.
Right, the March and April kinetic campaign.
Exactly. And the operational details here are just fascinating. The U.S. military targets and successfully cripples roughly 90 separate military installations on and immediately surrounding that island.
We're talking about taking out radar arrays, surface-to-air missile batteries, naval docking facilities.
Electronic warfare outposts. Yeah. They basically systematically blinded the island and stripped away decades of layered defense systems.
That's exactly what they did.
But here is the massive contradiction at the center of this deep dive. Despite launching precision strikes on 90 targets, the U.S. military meticulously avoided hitting a single oil storage tank, loading terminal, or pipeline.
Not one.
They dismantled the vault security system, tied up the guards, disabled the alarms, but they left the money sitting right there on the table.
Yeah. And if you look at the official press briefings from the Trump administration at the time, the stated rationale was, quote, decency.
Decency.
Yeah. The argument was that the U.S. does not target civilian heavy economic infrastructure.
I mean, looking at the geopolitics of this, that official narrative feels completely hollow, In modern great power competition, decency is rarely the primary strategic driver of a multi-billion-dollar kinetic military campaign.
You're not wrong.
So let me challenge the premise here. If the entire goal of American foreign policy in this region is to cripple Iranian power projection, to stop the funding of proxy militias, and to deter future aggression, and this island is the ATM that funds all of it, why not blow up the ATM? You have the target in your crosshairs. Why leave the server room perfectly intact?
Well, because taking out the server room creates an immediate, catastrophic economic boomerang.
Boomerang.
Yeah. The American military planners weren't just looking at the tactical map of the Persian Gulf. They were looking at the global macroeconomic board. Destroying that infrastructure would send a shockwave through the global energy market that would instantly rebound back onto the United States.
But hold on, let me push back on that a bit. You look at the raw export numbers, and Iran only accounts for about 1.5 to 2% of total global daily oil exports.
True.
Global supply chains absorb 2% shocks all the time. Like a severe hurricane season in the Gulf of Mexico can temporarily knock out that much capacity. Why is this specific 2% the trigger for a catastrophic boomerang?
Because, well, you're looking at it purely as a closed mathematical equation. And global energy markets actually operate on risk premiums, forward psychology, and the geography of transit.
Okay, unpack that.
The panic wouldn't just be about losing Iran's 2%. The psychological shock of watching Kharg Island burn to the ground would instantly spark market terror over the security of the broader Strait of Hormuz.
The ultimate choke point.
Exactly. So Strait of Hormuz is the transit artery for roughly 20% of all the oil consumed on planet Earth.
20%. Wow.
Yeah. If Kharg Island goes up in flames, the global commodities market immediately prices in the assumption that the entire strait is closing next. And when that risk premium is priced in, you aren't looking at a minor fluctuation.
You're looking at massive spikes.
Huge spikes. You're looking at projections of crude oil shooting past $150 a barrel almost overnight.
Oh, man. And a $150 barrel of oil completely rewrites the domestic political reality.
Absolutely.
That level of price shock triggers crippling, sticky inflation. The cost of shipping goods skyrockets, manufacturing stalls, and it hits the American consumer squarely in the jaw at the gas pump.
Right. And executing a strike that causes that level of domestic pain during an election year, that is political suicide for any sitting administration.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
But the calculus extends far beyond American borders, too. You have to look at the health of the broader coalition. A $150 barrel of oil fundamentally alters the debt-to-GDP ratios of key allied nations.
Like who?
Well, you have industrial powerhouses like Japan, South Korea, and massive economies in Western Europe that are structurally dependent on stable, affordable Middle Eastern energy flows.
So they would just grind to a halt.
Pretty much. If the United States triggers a massive energy crisis, they risk stalling the economies of their closest allies, effectively fracturing the very international coalition they need to contain Iranian influence in the first place.
So destroying the island creates an economic boomerang that hurts the U.S. and its allies way more than it helps.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. But there is a second layer to this restraint that is purely military, right? The threat of an uncontrollable asymmetric spiral.
Yeah. You have to ask yourself a very dark geopolitical question. What does a heavily armed, ideologically driven regime do when it suddenly realizes it has absolutely nothing left to lose?
Right. If the U.S. turns those oil tanks to ash, the regime's lifeline is gone. And Iran has openly telegraphed how they would respond to that existential threat.
We just talked about the Strait of Hormuz. They wouldn't just threaten it. They have the mining capabilities and fast attack craft to actively blockade it.
But it goes much further than naval warfare, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. They would immediately activate their entire decentralized proxy network. And this is where you have to understand how those proxy networks function.
We're talking about unleashing the Houthis in the Red Sea.
Right. To completely paralyze global commercial shipping. We are talking about Shia militias across Iraq and Syria launching coordinated, sustained rocket and drone attacks against every American forward operating base in the region.
But wait, earlier we established that Kharg Island is the ATM funding those proxies. If you destroy Kharg, doesn't the proxy funding dry up? Don't you essentially starve the militias?
Well, eventually, yes. Over a timeline of months or years, the financial starvation takes hold. But in the immediate short-term, like the days and weeks following the destruction of the island, a dying regime unleashes every single weapon it has already bought and stockpiled. You don't starve them. You trigger a massive, desperate lashing out. And the most vulnerable targets in that scenario aren't American troops. It's America's regional partners.
Like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates?
Yes. If Iran is cornered and their own oil revenue generation is physically destroyed, their immediate strategic response is to level the playing field. They have the ballistic missile and drone capabilities to strike the massive oil fields, refineries, and desalination plants of Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Which fundamentally explains why those regional allies, who you might assume would love to see Iranian capabilities wiped off the map, actually view this American policy of restricted military intervention quite favorably.
They view it favorably because they physically live next door to the blast radius. They understand that restricted intervention prioritizes their own national security and vital infrastructure. They do not want the U.S. to light a match in a powder keg when they're the ones standing in the room.
It perfectly illustrates that classic military strategy concept from Sun Tzu. Always leave your adversary a golden bridge to retreat across.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. If you surround an army and trap them with absolutely no way out, they will fight to the death and take you with them. But if you leave them a single narrow escape route, they will expend their energy trying to protect it rather than destroying everything around them.
Sparing the oil infrastructure is the United States deliberately building that golden bridge. By leaving the money on the table, the U.S. forces the Iranian leadership to pause and run a cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah.
They have to weigh the satisfaction of extreme asymmetric retaliation against the reality that they still have a highly lucrative golden goose to protect.
So this isn't just about avoiding a worst-case scenario. It isn't just restraint for the sake of caution. The U.S. is actively using the preserved infrastructure as a tool for ongoing diplomatic leverage.
They really are.
They've turned Kharg Island into a controllable pressure valve.
Exactly. It highlights the stark difference in grand strategy between seeking total regime change and seeking limited deterrence.
Total regime change is chaotic.
Very. It creates power vacuums, it's highly unpredictable, and historically, it often drags the U.S. into massive, decades-long ground occupations.
Yeah, we've seen that play out, but the strategy of limited deterrence we are seeing here is totally different. By surgically crippling the military defenses of the island in April 2026, but
Mhm.
leaving the oil flowing, the U.S. essentially turned Kharg Island into a permanent hostage.
The psychological message being broadcast to Tehran is crystal clear. It's basically, you still have your revenue stream, your regime is still breathing, but we have just demonstrated to the world that your defenses are entirely porous.
What?
We can bypass your radar and your missiles at will. We are allowing the tap to remain open, but we can turn it off tomorrow afternoon if we choose to. And you need that specific type of leverage to keep them away from the ultimate red line, right? The nuclear threshold.
Precisely. If Iran decides to suddenly sprint for a nuclear weapon, the U.S. doesn't need to mount a massive invasion. They just target the hostage. They hit the storage tanks.
Because the infrastructure was spared, Iran still has something tangible and existential to lose.
Yeah. And there is also a deeply pragmatic physical reality to this strategy that looks at the long-term post-conflict horizon. You always have to plan for the day after the war ends.
Oh, the environmental aspect of this is terrifying.
Yeah.
If you execute a bunker buster on a facility holding millions of barrels of crude oil, you aren't just destroying an economy.
No, you're not.
You are unleashing an apocalyptic environmental disaster directly into the Persian Gulf. The resulting oil slick would be unprecedented. It would decimate the maritime ecosystem, shut down international shipping lanes, and critically, it would foul the water intakes for the massive desalination plants that provide drinking water for the entire Arabian Peninsula.
So the collateral damage is just simply unacceptable.
Totally unacceptable. And from a purely geopolitical rebuilding standpoint, someone eventually has to clean that up. And someone has to pay to rebuild the state.
Right. If the broader Western strategy harbors any hope for a future, more pragmatic Iranian administration to eventually take power, that future government cannot inherit a completely shattered medieval state.
Exactly. They're going to need a functioning economy to maintain order and govern.
So by preserving the deep water ports, the T-jetties, and the hundreds of miles of subsea pipeline, the United States is intentionally keeping the foundational economic floor intact.
They are avoiding the astronomical multi-trillion-dollar reconstruction costs that would inevitably fall on the international community to rebuild a destroyed petrostate.
Man, so when you synthesize all of these distinct layered viewpoints, the bathymetry, the macroeconomics, the proxy dynamics, the post-war rebuilding, the main takeaway from the 2026 strikes becomes incredibly clear.
It really was a masterclass in applying highly controlled pain rather than outright destruction.
It completely redefines how we should look at modern great power competition. It is undeniable proof that the United States is currently prioritizing a grand strategy of rigorous containment over triggering a total, unpredictable collapse.
Yeah, you apply just enough kinetic pressure to force a change in your adversary's behavior,
Yeah.
but you deliberately stop short of shattering the entire system.
And it all centers on this tiny 25 square kilometer rock in the water.
It really is staggering.
We started this deep dive by picturing an unassuming, microscopic piece of land. But Kharg Island isn't just a collection of concrete, limestone, and steel pipes. It is the physical, tangible manifestation of both Iran's desperate existential need for regime survival and America's highly calculated, multi-layered strategy of containment. It's the ultimate pressure point.
It is quite literally the fulcrum upon which the stability of the entire Middle East is currently balancing.
So the next time you are scrolling through international news headlines or even just looking at the price of unleaded gas ticking up or down at your local station, I want you to think about Kharg Island. Think about the unseen, incredibly delicate mathematical game being actively played out by military planners and geopolitical strategists over a tiny stretch of water in the Persian Gulf.
And as we close out this analysis, there is one final, deeply provocative question you should be mulling over.
What's that?
Well, we have spent this entire time establishing that this incredibly delicate balance of global power relies entirely on an adversary having something highly concentrated and exposed to lose this single unavoidable island bottleneck. But what happens to the security of the broader Middle East and what happens to America's leverage if that adversary eventually engineers a way to completely bypass the island and begin securely exporting their energy directly over land routes?
Oh, wow. If the single point of failure disappears, the entire equation changes.
Completely changes.
That is a truly chilling thought to leave on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.